It's a good day to be a Bionicle fan. Why? Nothing in particular. Nothing special's happened, no special news or anything, but if you're still here celebrating Bionicle all these years later after the theme is no longer around, well, that's an extra special thing. And let's do that. Let's celebrate some Bionicle on this episode of the Bionicle Inspiration Series, where we showcase things that people have made across the Bionicle community, and we talk about them. We see the cool techniques that they've made, explore what they've done, and let that inspire you to make your own cool stuff. So today the theme is self-marks. You might have heard this term before, and maybe you use it in your own vocabulary, maybe you have your own self-mark. But what is a self-mark? Well, a self-mark has a lot of different definitions, and I've done a few episodes on self-marks before and gone into a lot of different details about what exactly one is. But essentially, it's a mascot for you as a builder. It could also be what you would look like if you were a Bionicle existing in some form of the Bionicle universe or your own made-up universe. It can be a physical representation of you, it can be a more symbolic representation of you, or it could just be a really cool Bionicle you made that you kind of feel embodies you in some way, or you just really like it. You go, hey, this is going to be my self-mark. So it's your sort of pseudo-mascot or a figure in your collection. A figure in your collection? A figurehead in your collection, I guess. So in the past, some of the other self-mark episodes we've done, we've talked about different ways that you can approach a self-mark, or how other people have made other people's self-marks, or additional things like how self-marks can evolve as you as a builder evolve. But today we're just going to take a look at just self-marks in general. You know, nothing, no sort of sub-theme behind this theme, or nothing too special about this one. We're just going to take a look at a bunch of examples of self-marks, and you know, hopefully just looking through lots of vastly different examples of them, you can get a few ideas for making your own, or perhaps updating your own, or, you know, just get a few ideas for anything in general. So let's start, shall we? The first self-mark today is by King Marshy, and it is also called King Marshy. So I love a good brick-built head. Certainly something that adds so much character to this mark is this really hardy beard, those beautiful blue eyes that stand out on the black and gold color scheme here, but also this snazzy helmet too. A lot of nice stuff going on here, but it's all possible because he's focused in on using a bit of system here on this Bionicle mark, and really helped it to look more impressive. You know, it's hard to get that sort of beautiful, well-rounded beard design like that, but if you're using system pieces, some of the smaller stuff there, you can really pack in elements like that. So that's just something cool, you know. And hey, maybe you yourself have a very hearty, snazzy looking beard in the real world, and maybe you want to put that on your self-mark, and this is a really good way to do so. In the past, I used to have, and this is like really early days of the Bionicle Inspiration Series, I used to have people be like, do an episode on helmets. And I was like, man, that's a tough one, because there's not a lot of mocks with helmets. Most people just have masks, because, you know, it's a sort of a trope in Bionicle, I guess. But this mock here kind of has a bit of a helmet, you know? Again, using the system there, it definitely looks like he's got more of like a, not necessarily a crown, but yeah, like a sort of style of headgear or a helmet of some kind there. Definitely a cool way of doing that, and a lot easier if you're using your system pieces too. I mean, to some degree, you could maybe flip a mask on its side or something, or take certain pieces that have the right kind of shape or texture to them and put that on top of a head design, and it could look like a helmet, but it might just look slightly off or not quite right. Of course, it depends on the techniques you use and the pieces you use, but I think here it works very, very well and very effectively, because it looks like a helmet and just flows with everything else nicely and works well. Another thing that flows and works well here is the sort of almost robe design. This armor here, some great color blocking as well, having the gold on top of the black there, so it very much looks like the armor is all one thing. The way that this sword kind of flows down into this sort of like robe just looks nice, gives him this very royal aesthetic, like he's got these rich flowing robes that you might see on some sort of god or emperor or king or something, which I kind of get a little bit of an aesthetic from this guy, or maybe not. Maybe he's also a little bit of just a very noble, strong warrior, and he's got this very large and in charge, noble, wealthy armor from his adventures and his fame that he's got from all of his quests and things. It's cool, a bit of story kind of coming out there, and just a nice looking design as well. I also quite like the Warhammer he's got here. Some of these newer system pieces here, which are a little bit of a 1x1 piece that has sort of like a pyramid on top. It's a bit similar to like a cheese slope, but it's instead of it sloping one way, it all slopes in the middle like a little mini pyramid. It's cool, and it's a nice way to create this spiked texture to this like Warhammer design here. It's really imposing and just looks really fantastic. So a really nice mock here by King Marshy, and a very clever, unique take on a self-mock. Let's move on to the next mock here. This is by Jordan Austin and is called Velen, Tower of Gravity / Tower of Shadow. So something that's cool about this mock here is it's sort of like kind of like an anti-version of the other, like a light and a dark to some degrees. Obviously, there's the Tower Velen of Gravity, and then the Tower Velen of Shadow, kind of like his evil clone self or his evil nemesis that's super similar, or maybe like his evil brother or something. I like that concept, and it's certainly a trope you could play with in all sorts of things. Making an evil version of your self-mock, or what kind of nemesis does your self-mock have, or a character in your story, who is the bad guy that they face. It could be if you're someone who really likes to dive into the story behind the mocks as well, and you haven't thought of a big bad evil guy, maybe that's something to start thinking about, because it would definitely be a beautiful impetus to start designing something, a new mock, or a really iconic character that you'll remember for a long time because it's a part of a story you created. So it's cool to see how these mocks are very similar, and like I said, there could be brothers or a clone or something like that. That's one's evil, one's good, and the subtle differences between the two. You've got the very similar designs with the Onawa masks in purple or black, very similar leg designs, hero factory pieces on the top there. Those other sort of protective, like kind of almost like knee pad like pieces there. Both of them have that in black and purple, but they're very subtle differences at the same time, which is nice. Things like the bottom of that lower leg design, one uses a system piece, one uses a hand connector. One of them has more kind of claws on their fingers, the other just has more sort of typical fingers. And then definitely the biggest sort of difference here is the shoulder design. What I love about that is the Tower of Gravity here has a more sort of rounded, more kind of noble looking design, whereas the Tower of Shadow here has these very spiky, pointy, large, pronounced, very spiky shoulders here. And I like the kind of visual storytelling behind that, the fact that one is, more calm, collected, noble looking and smoother, whereas the other one is a lot more sort of spiky and rigid and sharper. It definitely gives more of a sense of evil and more of a sense of calm to the other one, more of a sense of being a little bit more like grounded and noble and heroic. So a nice way of doing some very subtle things there to just kind of help show the differences between the two characters and the alignment that they have as well. That's really cool. And hey, if you want to do a mock kind of in the style of this, a good and bad version of a very similar looking mock, like a clone or a brother or something, definitely do what Jordan's done here of getting pieces that exist in multiple colors. So you have that mask that comes in silver, or the Turaga Doom mask, which is that beautiful marbled black and dark red, or the Onawa masks in multiple colors, and some of these other armor pieces in multiple colors. That could be a good way to, one of the first steps on this mock, just to make sure, okay, well, let me hunt through my collection, find a bunch of pieces that exist in two different colors, but it's the same piece, and often I find the hardest thing with starting a mock is actually starting. What's the first step that I take? Once you start getting the ball rolling, it's a bit more of a steady, easy process because you've begun, and sometimes that fear of, when I start this, is it actually going to be any good? How's it going to work as I go? And just where do I begin? I don't know, That might be a nice place to start, is just hunting for pieces and finding the ones that have shared colors and going, ooh, actually, you know what? I could use this piece because it's unique and it's different. I've never played with it before. I've never used it in a mock, or just looking at it, touching it, feeling it, moving it around, and having a think about it. You go, actually, this could work for a nice head design, or a nice torso, or perhaps a shoulder pad or something. It's a way of approaching a build for sure, and might be what Jordan did as well here. So it's a really cool concept there, and an interesting take on self-mocks and how you can work them into your story, and even the villain for them as well. The next mock we've got here is by Bin Parts, and it is called Yujo. So this mock came with a bit of a lengthier description here, and I read little bits of it, not all of it, and at some points he was saying that there were a couple images of posing it next to another MOC that was his self-MOC that shared the same name as this MOC, and then just another sort of base build. So I might actually be wrong here in that saying that this brown and white serpent MOC here isn't actually his self-MOC. But regardless, to my knowledge, maybe this Toa one is actually his self-MOC. But regardless, I think there's some cool stuff in here anyway. I like the fact that his other self-MOC, who is also called Yujo, I believe. I might have totally misread this email too. That could be my bad here. I definitely apologize there, Mr. Bin Parts. I'm misconstruing the information that was given to me. But what I like is that they have that shared color scheme. So we were just talking before about story, you know, and I've of course last episode of Biss was a color scheme episode on using the black in a color scheme, and I love how much symbolism can be used behind a color, but you know, if you're making your own Bionicle storyline, maybe color can go a little bit further than that, you know, maybe just to some degree quite similar to the Bionicle storyline. You know, if a Bionicle is a specific color, that can dictate the element they have control of or the tribe that they belong to. Or maybe it could also symbolize, you know, they're a part of a shared family or a shared allegiance, you know, maybe they have the same color armor because they're both, you know, working for the same guild or group or organization or something. So I kind of like that idea too of expanding out from a self-MOC and going, okay, well, yeah, who's his brother? Who's his friend? Who's his peer or colleague in this group or organization? You know, what shared elements does my self-MOC have that this other MOC could have? I like that, you know. But we will, of course, talk about Yujo here, this serpent character, because that was the one that was specifically submitted. And, you know, whether or not it's a self-MOC or not, it doesn't matter, because there's still some really cool stuff here that you yourself could implement into a self-MOC. And, of course, we had a little bit of a discussion there about how what might be his actual self-MOC does relate to some cool concepts you could be exploring with a self-MOC. So, anyway, love the idea, of course, of giving a MOC a serpent tail. You know, legs are cool, but there's always different ways of branching out with the leg design. You know, can you give them a non-humanoid look like this with a serpent tail, or maybe some wheels, or they just have jets for legs or something crazy, or they don't have any legs at all. All sorts of different possibilities, of course. Another thing I really like about this MOC is the color scheme, white and brown. That's a bit more unique, not something I've seen all that often, but it's a very nice color scheme actually. It's very, very different, but it works nicely. I still love the fact that there's some Borok shield pieces being used as kind of like van brasses or kind of armor there. It just looks very nice. And I also like the finger design on this too, using a more kind of realistic finger design. You know, the very typical like Hydraxon finger design there. Well, specifically Hydraxon had 4 fingers, but the one that a lot of people use in MOCs only really has 3 fingers. You know, it's not that realistic, but here, of course, you know, got the 5 fingers per hand there. It works well, so it's a more unique way of doing that finger design and more realistic as well. So if that's something that you want to do on a MOC and actually go as realistic as you can with a hand design, or just as realistic in general, yeah, this might be a similar hand design here that you could use yourself. Also, it looks like a more custom mask is being used here. Whether it's a 3D printed one or not, I don't know, but hey, nothing wrong with that. Of course, there's some people out there who go, you know, I'm not a big fan of using custom stuff, and that's okay. You're, of course, entitled to that opinion, but you know what? If you want to use one, no reason that you can't. And it looks fantastic here, and it gives it a very distinct, unique aesthetic, a more snake-like look to it to some degree, a more kind of alien-like look to it as well. Very, very unique and different. And, you know, there might be a very specific look you're going for that LEGO pieces can't quite achieve. So maybe introducing a custom element can help to do that. Always something to consider there. So yeah, really fantastic MOC here, and some interesting concepts with self-MOCs that we talked about, of course. Now, on to the next one. So this is Angus Drac, the last of his kind by Angus Drac, whose name I think I said differently both times I said it. Regardless, a pretty cool and unique self-MOC here. One thing I love about this is that he's using some of the newer pieces that come in some of the newer Ninjago sets. Take a look at some of those Ninjago sets, by the way. Some of that newer wave there is fantastic. A definite warning that I've done before as well. Don't sleep on Ninjago, you know? Sometimes you go like, you know, maybe not even specifically with Ninjago, but other LEGO themes, you know, you kind of go like, you know, whatever, it is what it is, whatever. And then years later you look back and you go, hey, wait a minute, that theme had some really good colors and really good pieces in it. Why wasn't I paying attention to it? And now it's too late. The theme's been discontinued, or they're not on shelves anymore, and yeah, maybe those prices have gone up a little bit, and they, you know, maybe just a little bit harder to get, sort of thing. So always be careful with certain themes. Make sure when you're next in the toy aisle there looking at the LEGO, have a closer look. You know, what sort of pieces are in there? Can you use them in a MOC? And as we see here, that some of those newer Ninjago sets have these beautiful trans green sword element pieces that kind of have this almost sort of digital look to them, but it's a beautiful shape to them, and they work very well on Bionicle MOCs here, and they work very well as swords or different types of weapons and things. It's cool. And we also take a look at the chest here. We can see some of the other Ninjago sword pieces also in that beautiful trans green color there, or kind of like a trans light green, I guess, not quite a trans green there. But those also work very well as little sort of additional kind of greebly details there on this character. And so all sorts of different pieces from these newer Ninjago sets you can play with. So you know, we spoke before about how with self MOCs, obviously they're to some degree a representation of yourself and of your building style, and you know, as new pieces come out, as your building style evolves, you know, maybe you want to update the self MOC. So do that. Take a look at some of the newer pieces that are coming out and play with them. And hey, maybe they'll be perfect for your self MOC. It's been around for a little while, but you know, could do with some updating perhaps, or you know, as newer things are introduced, you want to put them into it. So some concepts to think about there. But taking a bit of a deeper dive into this MOC here, I love the fact that he's used this dual molded Tahu mask here. Of course, it has that little bit at the top there that is in that trans light green color there, and it's nice that that's sort of to some degree helped to inform the color scheme on this MOC. You know, the gold, the red, and this trans light green there looks fantastic. It's a nice blend of colors and a great way to implement that mask as well. You know, some of those G2 masks that did have the kind of blends of different colors, the kind of marbled textures, or the dual molding of different colors, was, you know, some of those were really beautiful pieces. But you know, of course, if you are going to use them in a MOC, you have to make sure that you you know, have both of those colors in there. So hey, maybe that mask can be a stimulus for one of your MOCs. Can you pick up a mask in your collection and go, yeah, it's got some cool colors on it, got a couple different colors on there, I could make a MOC with this, I could make a self MOC with this, all sorts of possibilities. So yeah, pretty cool self MOC here. Let's move on to the next one. I have got a mosquito flying around my studio. I hate it. I can hear him buzzing in my ear sometimes. So if you hear that by the mic, you're like, what's that buzzing? Well, it's a mosquito. I'll find him. I'll find you. I'll find you. But before I find him, on to the next MOC. This is Coria by Coria. So I always love seeing hair on MOCs, and translucent blue hair. Great addition. Great idea. Looks fantastic. Using a bunch of these different claw pieces that you got in some of the G2 sets there. Looks like they're attached onto some sort of lightsaber rod there, and just sort of having them kind of flow a little bit, but in some fashion, actually resembling, you know, a little bit of hair. There's a nice design there, and looks really good. So can you give your MOC or self MOC some hair? Of course, using some of those pieces there could work really well, and a few other pieces being used again from G2 sets. Some of those kind of rib cage pieces that came on some of the skull villains there also works well to create this hair design here. Another thing I love on this MOC is the shoulder design here, using a whole bunch of these larger claw pieces here. Just a very unique look, giving them this more pronounced shoulder design, this more sort of unique look to the armor that they're wearing. It's just very different, very unique. I also like the necklace that this MOC's got as well, just a simple Lego chain and a T-bar and a gear on the end there. It's simple, but it works. It's a fun little design for sure. I also like the use of these, I believe they're rubber bands, but they could easily just as well be string. You know, putting that on the legs there, just you know, an additional way of just kind of carrying across a little bit more of the armor, or just the general aesthetic of this MOC. And you'd never underestimate rubber bands and string. You know, you of course don't actually have to use them for, you know, some sort of technique thing that requires string or rubber bands. You could use it for aesthetic purposes. So something to think about, an interesting way of advancing a MOC in some fashion and continuing an aesthetic like we see here. So there's some cool stuff on this one here. Let's move to the last MOC today. A few less MOCs than normal. Wanted this to be a little bit of a shorter episode, a little bit stretched for time this week, but we still got a biss out, that's all that matters. This one is by Marco and is called Deathlord Iskander. So the textures and the greebling on this MOC is very, very nice. Kind of on a whole nother level here. It's beautiful to see. You know, a lot of these days when you look at MOCs, more typically I would say the textures that people play around with are very smooth, organic looks. This MOC here is a lot more of a kind of greebled look, to some degree looking a little bit like Megatron or different Transformers from the Michael Bay movies there. A bit more of a very detail-heavy look to it. So it's not something you see every day, and it's certainly not well, that's not entirely true. It's not something you see every day that's been done in such a beautiful and refined way. You know, sometimes people can do some of those more greeble-heavy textures, and it can look a little messy or a little bit kind of all over the place to some degree. And that's not necessarily a critique either. It's just sometimes that can look the case, you know. But what I love so much about this is how it just all flows so well. It looks so nice, and it really helps to create this demon overlord look that this MOC has here. This whole bunch of different repeated spike elements throughout. It looks very skeleton-like, you know, especially that rib cage there. It's almost kind of gives the impression of a lot of, you know, bone-like fingers kind of grabbing onto someone and not letting go, kind of, yeah, giving you these little bits of horror, little bits of a little bit more intense vibes on this MOC. It's really cool, actually. So it's great to see some more rougher, unique textures being used on a MOC, and not kind of going with the norm of doing very smooth textures on a MOC, which is just kind of something you see a lot. And that's not a problem either, of course. If you want to play around with some smoother textures as well, do it. It always looks very nice. But it's always nice to play around with some different textures and things. You know, all sorts of different Bionicle pieces have different textures. So see what you can do. Something else I quite like on this MOC is the use of the more tattered. Actually, I don't know if that's a Vizon cape. I want to say that might be a Chima cape. Perhaps I'm wrong. But whatever it is, putting that little waist cape there also helps with this more sort of demon-like look there. Being a bit more tattered and rough really works. And I also love the use of what I believe is a Belleville saddle from like a horse. That little brown little like kind of satchel thing there on the side of the waist there. That's just a nice little addition and a great use of a more obscure Lego piece there. Another brown element on this MOC that I like is the upper legs. They're quite smooth, you know, and I like that actually. You know, you could make the argument of like, well, a whole MOC should have that same texture, but I kind of like that this bit is smooth. You know, he's got the cape around that. He doesn't necessarily need armor there because the cape's protecting him. Or additionally, it also kind of creates this interesting look where perhaps before you might have gone, oh, I reckon this MOC is this crazy weird demon that has this sort of metallic body, and that's his actual like skin. But the minute you kind of introduce this sort of brown element there, you kind of go like, oh, maybe not. Maybe he's actually wearing armor, you know, and those are boots. This is like a bit more of a chest plate, and he's got some gauntlets on and stuff, and it kind of changes things up slightly and gives you a different way of looking at the MOC. So I kind of like that you're really establishing what the MOC is wearing and painting a slightly different picture. You know, there's a little less, or to some degree actually a little bit more ambiguity to it. And you go, oh, maybe this is armor, or maybe this is his skin, who knows? And you just kind of play around there. It's a fun thing, I like that. Also cool to see he's holding some flames there. It's just a very striking look, and looks great in the picture. But I also love the little inclusion of the little skull shield piece there in the middle of his chest. It's just a really nice addition, works well. Always cool to introduce little printed pieces and shields and things on MOCs. Just a little pop of detail like that, always looks nice. So that's it for a few self-MOCs in this self-MOC themed episode of the Bionicle Inspiration Series. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to, well, I would say leave a comment, but unfortunately with the Copa law changes, you no longer can. But if you enjoyed this episode and you want to share your thoughts online, head on over to my Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or Discord server, all sorts of different places you can reach out and join the conversation. And hey, if you want to let me know your thoughts, I'd love to hear them. And if you want to submit some of your own MOCs to the show, you can do so through the submission email that you're currently seeing on your screen. It is also in the description below, so if you want to copy and paste it, it's there to do so. And yeah, submit some pictures or any information you want to include, as much or as little as you want, and eventually I'll do my best to put it on the show. Additionally, in the description are links to the MOCs that you saw in today's episode, so you can check them out in a little bit more detail and check out some of the other stuff these guys have made. And additionally, my links to my social media are also there. And on my social media, you may well see me post pictures of my self-MOC. So the journey continues even there. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode of the Bionicle Inspiration Series, guys, and I hope that you have a good rest of the week and you're building some cool Bionicle stuff soon. Happy building. I'll see you soon.